What's up, guys? Today we're going to be covering some basic principles in nutrition and how to go about using said principles to organize a diet that works well for your goals, whether that's physique, performance, or general feelings of well being. Some stuff we'll be touching on today: nutrient basics, so your macronutrients, micronutrients, what they are, what they do, where they come from, and some common deficiencies and whatnot to look out for. We'll be talking about energy balance, so the amount of calories it takes to maintain, increase, or decrease your body weight, touching on some real important and common goals such as weight loss, building muscle, and fueling for workouts. And at the end, we'll kind of wrap things together, trying to figure out how to use all of these strategies and whatnot in order to build a diet that works well, that's conducive for your lifestyle, works well for your goals, and is as easy and pain-free as possible. Now, some basics of nutrients here. Macronutrients. I think most of you at this point either know about or have at bare minimum heard of carbs, fats, and proteins, your three basic macronutrients. Carbohydrates and proteins are 4 calories per gram. Fats are about 9. So they're a bit more dense for the amount of volume of food that you're getting. Carbs are going to be things such as breads, pastas, rice, fruits, veggies, and whatnot. Carbs are going to be very, very important for fueling performance. They've kind of gotten a bad rap in recent years. There's a lot of people talking about and doing things like the carnivore diet, ketogenic diets, even things such as like your paleo diets, while high in whole grains and whatnot, can end up with you under consuming carbohydrates. Carbs are going to be really crucial for getting the most that you can out of your workouts and being able to put in a maximal effort. When you are under consuming carbohydrates or just timing them inappropriately, you're not going to be able to have that same pop during your workouts. They're really, really important for muscle glycogen, which is the fuel that your muscles hold in order to perform well and cause strong contractions. Carbs can be easy to overconsume if you're using the wrong sources. So some fiber-free ones and low satiety sources, some simple carbs. Your things like pastas, a lot of sweets and things like that. A lot of hyper-palatable, super processed foods can be very high in carbohydrates, which can definitely impact your blood sugar and whatnot if you're not careful to match that with your activity. Fats are things like your oils, your butters, animal fats, nuts, certain vegetables such as avocados and olives and things like that. Now, as I mentioned, fats are 9 calories per gram. They are really, really important for maintaining your hormonal health. If you're under consuming fats, it can really impact a lot of basic health processes that are really important for just general feelings of well-being and just general health principles. Now, they can also be very easy to overdo. A lot of low carb diets and low carb products end up really filling the gaps there with fats, and you're not getting the same nutrient density for the number of calories that you are going to be consuming. It's very easy to overeat on fats because they're super palatable and there's a lot of calories per unit of volume. Protein, the strength coach's favorite, obviously, are going to be coming from things like meats, dairy, soy, and a lot of indirect sources. You'll see these in whole grain foods. A lot of breads and whatnot have trace amounts, things like beans and butters, like the peanut butters and almond butter, things like that, do have some protein in them. They're not tremendously great protein sources due to the amount of calories per gram of protein in there, but can still be used as a way to accomplish and hit the numbers that you're looking for there. Now, as mentioned before, protein has 4 calories per gram. There is a bit of nuance here, though. It has a higher, what's called thermic effect of food. So the thermic effect of food is essentially how much energy does it take my body to digest certain things. Protein has a relatively high thermic effect of food. So we can almost get away with like a little bit of a hack here where if you're consuming a lot of protein, it actually takes your body more energy to digest it. So you get a bit more bang for your buck and you can get away with some higher protein intake. Now, on the side of high protein intake, what I see, it's particularly in female clients, is we tend to underconsume protein by a decent bit. I think it's very, very important in order to structure most of your meals and or snacks around high protein sources in order to hit the numbers that we're looking for. I'll be giving you some targets later in the video. Protein is really the main building block of muscle. You need adequate amino acids, which are what compose proteins, in order to build new tissue. That's going to be super, super important for getting the most out of the workouts that you're putting in. You don't want to put in a ton of work in the gym or on the track and what have you, and not be getting the maximum benefits because you're not recovering appropriately between that. So proteins can be very, very important and kind of the main structure that we're going to be building a lot of our diet choices around. So micronutrients, these are all of your vitamins and minerals. Some common ones that I see deficient, particularly in women: vitamin D. This is going to be really important for hormonal health. It actually acts a bit more of a hormone than it does a vitamin. It's really important for muscle growth. It's really important for energy in general, bone health, and things like that. And unless you're working outside and near the equator for multiple hours a day, most people will find that they are a bit deficient in vitamin D. Whether it's a clinical amount or not depends on the person, but there's a lot of factors that can go into vitamin D, such as your skin tone, again, the amount of sun exposure you're getting. It can be impacted by other nutrients. So I like supplementing with the vitamin D that has K2 in it. That'll help to increase the amount of vitamin D that you're absorbing from the amount that you're taking. B6 and to a certain extent B12, you can see deficiencies, particularly in women. Generally a pretty balanced diet and or a multivitamin or even a B complex can be enough to make sure that you're getting enough in there. Iron tends to be one that I see is low in women a fair bit. Sources such as red meats and vegetable sources like broccoli are really good. Generally, if you're getting enough protein in, if you're being pretty particular about your protein intake and eating some high quality animal sources, iron won't be a tremendous issue. But if you find that you struggle with energy and whatnot, it can be important to get tested and maybe even supplement with it in order to hit adequate amounts. Now, some subclinical markers that I see in exercising populations, we tend to be not necessarily deficient, but low in these vitamins and minerals. And this can be important for peak performance and general feelings of well-being. The majority of the things I'm touching on here are going to be your electrolytes. So potassium is one that I see pretty chronically underconsumed. I like having most clients, unless you're pretty small, like around 100 pounds or so, usually up as high as like 4,000 milligrams of potassium a day. Most people are not even coming close to that. Potassium can be really important for hydration as well as muscle contraction, and it can kind of offset some of the negatives that you'll see with super high sodium intake. So if you're eating a really high sodium diet with low potassium, a lot of times that's when you'll end up seeing things like high blood pressure and whatnot. It's going to be really important to get things like potatoes, bananas, avocados, spinach, all really, really good sources of potassium. Magnesium is another one that's pretty chronically underconsumed. There's a lot of forms of this that work really well depending on your goals, and it's one of the few things I really recommend a lot of people directly supplement with. So things like magnesium citrate can be really good for if you're having trouble with constipation or regularity. Magnesium glycinate can be excellent for sleep. This is a precursor for melatonin, and glycine also helps with that process. Magnesium threonate can be excellent for cognition if you're struggling with things like brain fog or just general feelings of slowness. Can really enhance some of your working memory and things like that. I like to use magnesium glycinate personally before bed. I find that helps my sleep pretty tremendously. And it tends to be one of the more bioavailable sources. So you actually absorb a bit more of something like a magnesium glycinate than you will with a magnesium citrate or oxide, although those work well too, depending on your goals. Sodium, I also will see underconsumed in a lot of exercising populations. This one you do have to be a little bit careful with. If you're already struggling with blood pressure issues or things like that, it can be important to really not overdo it. But on that note, only about 30% of the population is actually sodium sensitive. So a lot of people, when you're seeing things like high blood pressure, will actually not be taking in enough potassium. Or if they take in a lot of sodium, it doesn't really particularly impact things like blood pressure. Sodium is really, really crucial for hydration in general. Some people are taking in a ton of water and almost no sodium and wondering why they're still constantly feeling dehydrated. It's also really important for muscle contractions. Every contraction that you do involves sodium. It's really important in order to shuttle nutrients to the proper places, maintain your hydration, and optimize your performance. So, energy balance. Calories in, calories out has gotten a bit of a weird reputation if you start listening to things online. People will say it's not that simple. Now, just because there's a lot of factors that go into it doesn't mean it's not necessarily that simple. When it comes to an energy balance, in order to maintain your body weight, the calories in have to match the calories out. Now, I think people forget that we can manipulate both sides of that equation. Your calories out are going to depend on a whole lot of different factors that we'll touch on in just a little bit. For starters, calories in is going to be your intake. That's how much are we eating on average. I like to average things across the span of about a week. Your day to day is really important, but if you know that on Saturdays you tend to go out to eat and we eat, 600 more calories than normal, averaging that across the week is going to be really important. On the same front, it's going to be really important if you're trying to bulk up a little bit and you're going on certain busy days, maybe Mondays and Thursdays, you have a lot of meetings and you're super, super busy and aren't eating the same amount. If you're 500 calories down on those days, it needs to be equated across the week. So finding an average works really well. For most people, keeping it consistent will work a little bit better, but you can definitely manipulate that by implementing different strategies on different days. Intake tends to be the easier side of the equation to manipulate, and we'll expand on that in just a second. Output. The caloric output that you have is going to be dependent on your RMR, which is your resting metabolic rate, how much energy you are burning at rest. A large portion of this is going to be genetic and also really according to your current body weight. So if your weight goes up, it's going to take a few more calories to maintain that. If your weight goes down, it takes a little bit fewer. Total daily energy expenditure. This is going to be how many calories you're really outputting during the day. The two components of this are going to be exercise and non-exercise activity. Exercise obviously will burn some calories and will also continue to burn calories following exercise. With weight training, tends to be about 36 to 48 hours afterwards as you're repairing your muscles. With cardiovascular exercise, tends to be a little bit smaller of a window, somewhere between 12 and 24 hours. You will burn a few more calories during cardiovascular exercise, but the effect afterwards can be a bit more impactful. Non-exercise activity is going to be things such as, you're walking, just daily activities, getting up, getting dressed, going to work, how much you're wandering around, or even things such as fidgeting during the day are going to have an impact on the total number of calories that you're outputting. Now, there is a range that it comes to when there's a set point when it comes to manipulating this balance. For example, just because I'm intaking 200 calories fewer than I was initially, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm in a 200 calorie deficit. There is a range and a set point for each weight. Sometimes it's a few hundred calories, it's a 300-400 calorie range. So if you find that you lower your calories down and after a couple of weeks things aren't really budging, it could just be that you're on the low end of this range that it takes to maintain the specific body weight that you've got going. It also will shift a bit. There's metabolic adaptation. As I mentioned, a smaller body requires fewer calories. Also, a lot of times when your calories start to go down, movements will subconsciously be a lot more efficient. You'll fidget a little bit less. Your walking becomes more efficient, so you won't burn quite as many calories. So there is a little bit of play and nuance here to manipulating these variables. Increasing muscle mass is also going to be a really big contributing factor. We'll expand on this on the next slide in just a little bit. All right, weight loss. Really, when asked calories in, calories out, does it work? Yes, you have to be in a net negative energy balance. So the calories that you take in have to be lower than the calories that you burn if you're trying to lose weight. There's a lot of individual variety here, so a lot of experimenting is going to be really, really important. First off, when it comes to actually determining the number of calories that your body requires, there are many different equations you can do for this. If you're someone that's tracking and trying to actually figure out this number, pretty much any online calculator will work very well for you. They're all very similar, and you need to play with it for a couple weeks. All of these are estimates. So unless you are dead center in the middle, median of the population, and like a perfectly average person, things might be a little high or a little low for you. So it's going to be important to find kind of that set point over a couple weeks and then adjust from there. When it comes to burning calories, exercise, as I mentioned, will obviously increase your output. The first factor here is going to be the calories burned during. I think a little bit too much focus is generally put into the actual calories burnt during the exercise, and not enough attention is paid to the calories that are then used to repair your muscles and whatnot, and also to restore the energy sources used in order to accomplish that exercise. So For example, cardiovascular exercise versus weightlifting. People can get a little bit discouraged when it comes to seeing that, oh, I worked out really hard. I lifted for an hour, but I barely burnt any calories. I got an equal amount with 20 minutes, 30 minutes on the elliptical. Yes and no. Your muscles will tend to burn more energy following a weight training session than it will with a cardiovascular session. So it keeps your metabolic rate a little bit higher. That's why regular exercise is going to be really, really important. Also, increasing your muscle mass gives you a bit of a bigger engine. And now it doesn't necessarily increase your calorie burn at rest. That's a bit of a misnomer. But as long as you keep using it, it kind of functions as a bigger engine to soak up those calories that you're taking in. So more muscle mass can burn through more energy. More energy needs to be replaced, i.e., your intake can be a little bit higher with adequate muscle mass. Daily activity is also going to be really important, arguably more important. It's really, really difficult to have this like sedentary athlete lifestyle where you work out super hard or like go play a sport for an hour and a half, but then you sit on your butt for the remaining 14 hours of the day. It's pretty hard to outtrain a bad diet on that front and an inactive lifestyle. So if anyone was a client in person, I'm sure you've heard me harp on the things like 10-minute walks or little things like parking further away from the grocery store and trying to walk a little bit further. Just including it in your day can really move the needle pretty well, even more so than the regular exercise when it comes to actually losing fat. Now, metabolism is another factor that plays into the calories out portion here. This is going to vary considerably between individuals. Just because two people are both 150 pounds and say 5'6" does not mean that their caloric requirements will be the same, even if their activity is the same. So a lot of that is genetic. So it requires a little bit of play and some adapting and a little bit of nuance and really testing to figure out where your set points are. Something that gets pointed out as metabolism is you'll hear a lot like, oh, well, I'm not in college anymore. I can't eat what I used to. Metabolism actually does not slow quite as much as people used to think that it did. It actually stays pretty consistent from age 20 to 60. Now it'll ramp up. You're not going to be able to do the same thing when you're 15 as when you're 30, but ages 20 to 60, there's really not a whole lot of change. It's been pretty well established that for the most part, it's either the intake side of the equation changes, so they're intaking more calories, or the output. Generally, you're not going to be as active as you were in college, walking to classes, going and seeing friends, being a lot more social, moving around, playing sports, versus working a desk job, having a kid, and being exhausted when you come home, sitting on the couch for 6 hours before you go to bed. It's really important that we start to establish good habits that include us moving more throughout the day to really increase that daily activity quite a bit, because that tends to be the place where we can move the needle the most. The exercise portion will keep us healthy and make sure that we have adequate muscle mass. The daily activity is going to be probably the bigger needle mover when it comes to actually keeping the body composition that we're really looking for. You can see on the right here, I'll talk about these a little more in a minute, but I'll post these down in the comments as well, or in the description rather. If you want a little bit more of a breakdown on diet design, if you want to touch on some of the metabolic adaptations with age, and if you want a tracker, my personal favorite free app is Chronometer. A lot of MyFitnessPal and some of the other popular ones are now behind a paywall for some pretty basic features. So I think Chronometer tends to be the best one there. It's got a full micro and macronutrient breakdown. You can scan your foods. Anything with a barcode is going to be really useful. So it just makes it a bit of an easier experience. When it comes to weight loss with the calories in, people will say just eat less. Do you need to intake fewer calories with a steady calorie output in order to lose weight? Yes. That doesn't always necessarily mean less food. Caloric restriction is obviously a really important part of altering this energy balance to get into a caloric deficit, but it's really important to find a method that does not feel tremendously restrictive to you. Restriction is required, but certain strategies for restriction are not going to feel as restrictive. So things like getting in enough protein, filling the remainder of your dietary preference with fat and carbs. So say we need 1,500 calories a day. You get zero point 0.8, zero point 0.9, 1.0 grams of protein per pound of body weight, filling up the rest of it with kind of your dietary preference. Usually, I prefer for exercising populations that people go lower fat and higher carb. It just works a bit better for performance, especially in advanced people. You're going to need those carbohydrates that we touched on earlier. We need those to fuel our training. You can't go too low with the fat. We do need to maintain enough in order to just make sure that we're satisfying the requirements to keep our hormone levels appropriate. But generally, it's a little bit easier to keep the carbs a little higher. Fat tends to be not very or extremely calorically dense. So again, you're not getting as much volume as of food. So it can be easier to overconsume. Some really important strategies that I find, just some real basic ones. Eating satiating foods. I mentioned before, high protein tends to be a lot more satiating. That means it fills you up and keeps you fuller longer. So if hunger is an issue and you're under eating protein, you're really shooting yourself in the foot there. You're not only not going to be intaking enough protein in order to gain muscle, but you're probably also like cueing those hunger drive to be up a little bit higher than it should be. Fiber does a really important thing as well, very similar. Trying to get a minimum 25 grams a day or 14 grams per 1,000 calories. This is for women. It's 38 grams of fiber for men on average is the general recommended. Really important for gut health. Again, satiety can be super important for your gut microbiome. A lot of insoluble fibers are actually what the bacteria in your gut feed on, so that will keep you a lot healthier if you tend to have gut issues. A real easy rule of thumb: try to make sure that you get a decent protein source with everything, and then pick either carbs or fats. Foods that are high in both carbohydrates and fat tend to be not very satiating and super calorically dense. So if you think of something like cookies and cake and whatnot, they're high in both carbs and fats. They're easy to eat, which means it's very easy to overconsume them before you start to feel some of those satiety cues. So feeling filled up. It's real easy to demolish something like a couple thousand calories when it comes to eating a sleeve of Oreos versus getting something like a lean protein plus some carbohydrates or plus some fat. So you can have like a fattier steak or a leaner cut of meat then with some carbohydrates on the side. And that'll tend to satiate you a little bit better. On that same front, trying to get foods that have really high volume or water content with low calories. So fresh fruits and veggies. If you think about that, you get a lot of like a large portion of food for not a ton of calories. Getting the water content in there can be tremendously different. So if you find something like raisins versus grapes, a raisin is going to be super calorically dense. You're not getting a whole lot of food. It's easy to shovel down a ton of them versus grapes. You'll get a pretty tremendous amount of like size of food. It takes you a little bit longer to eat them. And that means that it gives your body to kind of catch up with those satiety cues. You'll find a lot of times that as you're eating, there's a certain amount of time where your body will let you eat before you fill up. What you're doing during that time can really drastically change based on the types of foods that you're intaking. So some other really important methods I've found that help restriction feel less restrictive. One, tracking. Measure the food. It can be very easy to think that you're estimating like, oh, I'm taking in 1,200 calories a day. And then you end up actually weighing out your food and measuring all the oils and whatnot that you're using. And you find out like, oh, I'm actually eating, a cup more rice than I thought I was. I'm using, instead of a tablespoon of oil, I'm using 3. And all of a sudden, those 1,200 calories become 1,800 calories. So tracking can be a really good way just to kind of keep you honest. It doesn't work super well for everybody, but if you're one of those real type A people that really like to know exactly where you're at and you don't mind measuring things out, it will make things a lot easier, especially when it comes to adapting the calories that you're taking in per day. It will certainly be a lot simpler to know where you're at and where you need to adjust to if you actually know what you're intaking. But I get that that's not for everybody, so it's not usually my first line of defense. Other strategies: just figuring out the types of foods, avoiding or limiting really calorically dense foods, and picking foods that fill you up more. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, foods with high fiber, high protein, high water content will all fill you up a little bit more. You'll find them a lot more satisfying and satiating. And that's a great strategy to end up limiting the caloric intake without actually putting a ton of thought into it. You just eat these foods that tend to fill you up a little bit more instead of picking things that are a ton of calories per bite. It makes you feel like you're eating a little bit more, It keeps you fuller for longer and limits the calories. Amount of food. So this is where it starts to come into some personal preference. Eating smaller meals can be a good strategy for some people. If you just find that you want to sit down and eat, but you don't tend to eat until you don't need to eat a ton, like me personally, if I eat like a quick snack or something like that, I find I get filled up pretty quickly, especially if I wait a little bit. So for some people, eating some smaller meals tends to be the way to go. It'll keep you a little bit fuller, keep you satiated. You don't have to wait as long when you're hungry to actually intake something, but it keeps you satisfied. Something else you can do is restricting time. Eating in specific windows or not after certain times is a pretty popular way to go about things. So if you find that like a midnight snack for you, that's almost never going to be a super healthy food choice, right? What do we reach for? It's cookies, ice cream, things like that. So if you're just like, well, I'm not particularly hungry, that I'm just bored, maybe we say after 7 p.m., I don't eat anymore, because that tends to be the time where I'm just blowing it out of the water, or I'm just eating because I'm bored. Frequency, multiple smaller meals or limiting snacking depending on the preference. So if you're someone that feels like you overeat when it comes to meals, like if you get hungry, you tend to really blow it out of the water and just pile in until you feel sick. It might help you to eat a little bit more frequently. Don't let yourself get super hungry. That can be really, really useful. On the other side of things, maybe if you're someone that snacks consistently, but you're not really hungry, you're eating just because you're bored, maybe it helps to eat a bigger meal, like especially in the morning or right at lunch, just to limit the amount of time before you get hungry. Either that or bringing in things that fill you up. Again, so a snack with high fiber, some carrots, some fruit, or something like that can be really useful. Things like a protein shake, having that, if you know you're starving and come dinner time, you're going to really just go kind of hog wild. Strategy I've used pretty successfully with a lot of clients is getting a small protein feeding in about 30 minutes prior, 20-gram protein shake, just so when you go in, you're not super ravenous, and it really cuts down on the kind of like animalistic behavior you have when you get really, really hungry. So just figuring out what cues work really well for you there. Stimulus control is one of my favorites that I use for just about everybody. This works well for both diet and exercise, by the way. There's ways to kind of manipulate your day just to make good decisions easy and the bad decisions hard. So the big example I like to give is prepping your food ahead of time. For example, packing lunch when it comes to work. If you're really hungry and you're trying to stick to your diet, it's much easier when you have an option that's sitting there in front of you. If I pack, for example, some chicken with a bunch of veggies and a bit of rice, I'm going to be perfectly satisfied with that choice when it's right in front of me. If it comes down to, oh, I need to go buy something and Taco Bell is right across the street versus like the supermarket with some pre-made salads and whatnot, I know what decision Hungry Dan is going to make, and it's probably not a good one. I need to kind of outsmart that person before he shows up, right? So we have this option available before we need to make the decision. That's a lot harder to do when it comes down to crunch time. Another thing I like, out of sight, out of mind. You'll see like the classic people keep things like, for example, a bowl of M&Ms are sitting on the counter, or like cookies are sitting out where there's something that you see, and maybe you weren't even hungry for something like that. If it's just sitting on the countertop, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I want this cookie. No, it's sitting there. If it had been sitting away in the count, like in a drawer or in a cabinet, you might not have thought about it in the first place, and you wouldn't have craved it at all. Or if someone had asked you, you're like, no, not really. But when you see them, like, oh, that looks good, that smells good, it can tend to kind of cue you into things that you wouldn't normally have reached for. um, Another really easy way to do things is, for example, I had a client that she really loved her chips, and she's like, I need to cut them out. I need to cut them out, but I'm terrible at it. Like if they're in the house, I'm demolishing them. I'll eat a whole bag when I'm sitting down and watching TV. It's like, okay, so some strategies we can do there. One, if you find that when you're watching TV, you tend to just really mindlessly eat, maybe you try to cut it to like, yeah, I can have this snack, but I won't do it while I'm watching TV. Or you limit the portion that's available to you. What we did with her was, instead of bringing the whole bag over to the couch when we sat down and watched TV at night, we'd put some in a bowl and we'd go over there and then we'd eat them. Now, if you want more, you can go back for more. But a lot of times you find that you're satisfied instead of just like mindlessly munching on things when you're watching something else, paying attention to something else and splitting the attention. It can end up really still satisfying that craving and also not letting you just kind of shut your brain off and eat continuously. So it can be really important to use any of these strategies, figure out what works best for you, and combine a couple of them to make things as pain-free as possible. Again, really the big goal here is to find the type of restriction that feels least restrictive to you. All right, eating for muscle gain. Big issue I see, again, particularly with female clients, is insufficient protein or insufficient calories in general. Really, the big one I'm going to say is protein, because you'll tend to find that the carbs and the fats and stuff will tend to come on their own unless you're being really, really strict about your diet. So I'll put protein as the most important. Most people are under eating here. For a relatively lean individual, I would say 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight. I'll push this even a little bit higher if we find that hunger is a big issue. But I really like to keep it as high as I can while staying within a allotted amount of calories that we're intaking. Now, there is a little bit of flex here. If you're someone that feels like you need to lose north of 10-15% of your body weight, and that's your goal, is losing, let's say, 20, 30, 40 pounds, a gram per pound of body weight might be unachievable. That can end up being a kind of preposterous amount of food. But I think what's really important is just centering diet choices around high protein. So breakfast, for example, 2 eggs is a pretty common breakfast, but that's only 12 grams of protein. If you have to take in 120, 150, 200 grams of protein, that's a pretty tall chore when you're only knocking off 8-10% of it in the morning. Getting in things like lean proteins. Greek yogurt is one of my personal favorites. I can use that for really a lot of different things. I can use it as yogurt itself. I can use it as, I've been making like sauces and things like that, or using it for like dips. I'll flavor it with different things. I'll sub it in for mayo, for example. Like if you're big on chicken or tuna salad, instead of using mayonnaise, we can sub in Greek yogurt. I'll add some salt, pepper, and garlic to the actual yogurt itself, throw it in there. I'll use it as a dressing in place of ranch. That can be really helpful in a way to sneak in some extra protein, or to thicken up a shake or anything like that. It can be really, really helpful. With protein, the most important thing is going to be the amount. If you have to get in 80 grams of it with a chicken breast at night or something, that's good. It generally works a little bit better to spread that out a bit throughout the day. It's not the most important factor, but it can make it a little bit more effective when it comes to your muscle gain. Timing doesn't seem to be super relevant when it comes to adequate intake. I do still like people taking in a protein shake or something after a workout, just because it's a decent time to get in, like to sneak in some extra protein. But that whole anabolic window does not seem to be nearly as important as we once thought it was. So yeah, throughout the day, I think it's generally easiest. I'd say minimum 2 meals a day. It can get pretty weird if you're a 1 meal a day type of person to try to get in, 120 grams of protein. That's a tremendous amount of food. Minimum 2, preferably 3. Once we start creeping up to 4, 5, 6, I'd say it becomes a little bit less important, and it comes down to just dietary preference at that point. Protein sources are also a big talking point here. I have a pretty strong preference for animal products, if that fits into your dietary choices and lifestyle, just because they're super nutrient dense. They have the real proper distribution of amino acids. Things like lean meats, lower fat dairy sources like a non-fat Greek yogurt, skim milk, a lot of things like egg whites and stuff like that. Whey protein can be really, really effective, and again, have all the appropriate amino acids. Vegan and vegetarian sources, and some of those trace sources we talked about earlier that you'll find them in like the whole wheat breads and things like that, they can work fine, but it takes a little bit more nuance. It can be difficult to get in the amount of protein that you need without extra calories, because they're always going to be paired with fats or carbs. It's just things like beans or peanut butter will have some protein in them, but you have to start to watch the calories at that point. The other issue is most vegan sources are going to be incomplete protein. So you're not actually getting the proper amino acid profile. It's not tremendously difficult to do, but you just have to pay a little bit more attention. Something like rice and beans, both of them have a little bit of protein in them and will make a complete nutrient amino acid profile. But again, you just have to watch it a little bit more carefully. Now, fueling for your workouts. especially when we're looking at things like a weight loss diet. It can be easy to come in and feel like you're dragging a little bit during your workout. So this is where adequate carb intake becomes really, really important. Carbs are going to be your friend here. Insufficient carb intake can lead to faster depletion of the muscle glycogen. It's that fuel source we touched on earlier. That's what's really going to make your muscles contract and allow you to do more repetitions during your workout. One of my favorite strategies, especially if you're on a relatively low calorie diet, is to make sure that you're getting 30 to 60 grams of carbs 30 to 60 minutes prior to your workout. It can really increase your performance, which is then going to increase your results pretty substantially. If you're working out midday after a few meals, it's not going to be as important because you tend to have enough carbs just sort of floating around at that point. But if you are a first thing lifter in the morning, I see a lot of you guys popping in 5, 6 a.m. It can be really important to get in just that little snack or something beforehand. That'll help fuel you up. Because if you think about it, if you're working out at 6 a.m. and you ate dinner at 6:30, you're almost on a 12-hour fast. Most people, if I flip that on its head and they only ate breakfast and then I told them to go work out at 7 p.m., would be like, no, I haven't eaten anything. So you need to be careful with that window there, is making sure that we're actually getting just a little something. If your stomach becomes an issue with intaking a whole lot of food, it doesn't need to be a lot. Half a Gatorade, a couple pretzels, a banana or something, even that can be really, really helpful. Post-workout carbs are also going to be really important. This is where that anabolic window that I mentioned actually comes into play. So getting some carbohydrates in within probably an hour or so can actually influence the next workout that you're going to have. So getting in those 20, 30 grams of protein, like from a protein shake, on top of it will actually increase carbohydrate absorption. So it replenishes that muscle glycogen. If you miss this window, you actually don't refuel quite as well for up to like 36, 48 hours afterwards if you have a really hard workout. So getting in those carbs right afterwards can be really, really important. So it works well to if you're just planning a meal right afterwards, that's perfectly fine. If not, again, a piece of fruit or like a Cliff Bar or something paired with a protein shake, or you can blend up like a banana or some honey or something into your protein shake, can be a really useful way to then replenish those glycogen stores and make sure you're ready to rock for the next workout. Staying hydrated is going to be really important. Hydration is really, really crucial for performance and for injury prevention. Dry tissues are a little bit more brittle and a little bit more vulnerable. So this doesn't mean just chugging water all the time. If you are, again, when you see like caloric restriction tends to be some like quote unquote cleaner foods, there generally is not going to be as much sodium in those. So for one, salt your meals. I think that's really important. It also helps you utilize some of the water that you're actually taking in. It keeps you more hydrated in taking more sodium. Fluid is really what helps mobilize those fuel sources, like the muscle glycogen or things like creatine, phosphate. All of those things that help you really move weights and have a good workout will not be as effective. Dehydration will not only decrease your performance, but it's going to decrease your pain tolerance as well. So not only do you have not as much fuel moving around, the level of discomfort that you're experiencing is going to be a little bit higher. So if you're doing, for example, like some high rep squats, we all know that burns. It sucks. If you start to crank up the meter on that, you might quit a little bit early and not get quite as much out of your workout as you would have if you'd come in hydrated and well prepared. And again, that injury risk. If you think about something like, ever see a rubber band that dry rots, it's just not as flexible, it's not as malleable. Things snap a little bit easier. That's when you'll see not only poorer tissue tolerance, but also worse decision making. It can start to, if you're dehydrated to the extent of like 2, 3, 4% of your body weight, it can actually affect some of your coordination and whatnot. So form deviations and things like that can start to happen a little bit more. So really important, we stay hydrated. Carbs will also help hydrate you as well. So if you're super low on carbs, you will not be as hydrated. So pairing those things together can be helpful. So the ideal pre-workout, at least in my book, carbs, sodium, and water. So either a full meal, 90 minutes, 2 hours out, or getting that 30 to 60 minute window, just a quick little like 30, 40, 50 grams of carbs, something like a couple pretzels. So you get your salt intake in, you get your carbs in, maybe a piece of fruit, you get some water content and some carbs out of that as well, plus a bottle of water, and you're golden. You're going to be set up really well to be successful that day for your workout. So to recap, Eat to support your goals. Nutrition is going to be a really, really big piece of the puzzle here, guys. It's almost impossible to out train a bad diet. That goes both ways. It's hard to out burn more calories than you're taking in. It's also going to be really, really hard to train super hard when you're not taking in an adequate amount and or macronutrient breakdown during your meals. So doing easy things, choose high quality protein sources. Those animal products are ideal. If you're doing vegan or vegetarian sources, make sure you're pairing it with another form of protein in order to get an adequate amino acid profile. Easy things, aim for primarily whole foods and adjust your caloric intake in a manner that aligns with your physique and dietary preferences. Make sure we're really utilizing some of those strategies that I mentioned before. If you are someone that tends to overeat at dinner time, just because you're starving, have a snack beforehand. If you find that you snack really frequently, use high volume foods. Keep protein and fiber and high water content in. That will naturally start to lower the number of calories that you're taking in without actually sacrificing any of the satiety and satisfaction that you're getting out of them. So it takes a little bit of play there. It takes a little bit of nuance and it takes some adjusting, but find what works for you. Do your best to stick to it and make adjustments as you see fit based on your performance and how close you are to getting to your goals. If you have any questions, either drop them in the chat, leave it in the comment, depending on where you're watching this for. And we'll see you guys next time.